Of all of the videos on my channel, there are a few of them that get viewed more than anything else, and there's one topic that they all focus on, and that topic is intimate partner homicide. And I'm glad that people are listening, because honestly, my number one goal is to save lives by alerting people to the fact of intimate partner homicide and teaching people how to avoid it, building them up so that they can avoid it. That's the purpose of this channel. You shouldn't have to die at the hands of your significant other or your ex. Neither should your sister, your cousin, your mother, your friend, or that neighbor down the street. Do you know how relationships go from romance to murder? That's what we're going to talk about today. If you're new here, welcome. My name is April Hardy. On this channel, we talk about domestic violence, including how to get away from it and how to thrive after it. If you're returning, welcome back. It's nice to see you. Let's get into this. In 2019, so really recently, there was a study that was published called Intimate Partner Femicide, using Falcadian analysis to track an 8-stage progression to homicide by Dr. Jane M. Smith, where she determined 8 steps that most male abusers take before murdering their female partners. So that's what we're going to go through today. Really quick, the 8 stages are 1. Pre-relationship, 2. Early relationship, 3. Relationship, 4. Triggers, 5. Escalation, 6. Change in thinking or decision, 7. Planning, and 8. Homicide. Obviously that doesn't give a whole lot of information, so that's why we're going to go through each of these individually. Stage 1, pre-relationship. So in cases where men had previous relationships, previous partners, there was always a history of controlling patterns of abuse, of stalking. Not everybody starts in stage 1 because not all of these murderers ended up having had previous relationships, but for those that did, this pattern was already a part of their life. And I want to read you a quote from this article because it perfectly shows one of the things that we were just talking about in the last video. If you haven't seen that yet, I'm going to link it up here. But we talked about a refusal to act on the red flags that we see in a relationship. And this quote just perfectly says what I was thinking when I was writing that stuff down. It says, victims had often been aware that the perpetrator had a history of abuse on entering a relationship, but did not always believe reports from former partners. And then this is the quote that they gave. He said his ex-wife accused him of domestic violence, but she, the victim, didn't believe that was true. She believed him when he said that his ex was just vindictive. She, which because she's a part of this study means that she is a now murdered victim of intimate partner violence, she saw the red flags that he had somebody that had accused him of domestic violence before, and she chose to ignore that red flag for whatever reason. And I'm not blaming in any way. I'm just saying this is a perfect example of what I was talking about in the previous video. I have been guilty of this too, 100%. Seeing red flags, knowing red flags, and refusing to believe them or justifying or rationalizing them away in some way. Like she chose to believe that he said that this woman was vindictive and that she was just out to get him instead of believing what the woman had said. I remember distinctly, for just an example, one of many, many, many in my life, where I had a boyfriend who had a woman filed a protection order against him while we were together, like right after we had started dating. And one of the major accusations in this protection order was that she had been raped by him. And he was like, she's lying, I never raped her, blah, blah, blah. Did I choose to stop dating him at that point? No. Should I have? Yes. Come on. If somebody is going to say that, like, the likelihood of that being a lie is small. The likelihood of this woman saying that her partner had been violent and there had been domestic violence, very small. Like, the smart thing to do would be to listen to that, because what are you really out if it's wrong? But you're about to find out what you're out if they were right and you chose to ignore that red flag. So stage 2, early relationship. If you talk to people, oh my gosh, this is so common. It just creeped me out when I was reading about it. Early relationship. The relationship has always changed once commitment is established. I was talking to somebody about this the other day. In the beginning, there are lots of romantic gestures and I love yous, even though most couples had just met. This is a tactic known as love bombing. Here's a description of love bombing. Love bombing is a pattern of behavior wherein the abuser overwhelms the potential victim with grand romantic gestures, proclamations, and promises. The most common of these is professing their love very early in the relationship. The goal of love bombing is to overwhelm a potential victim, moving so quickly in the relationship that the victim doesn't have time to think about or process what's going on. The batterer will likely bombard the victim or, quote unquote, sweep her off her feet with romance. And then once the perpetrator has gotten his partner to commit to him, then he wouldn't let her go, is what was found in these studies. And I hear so many people, it's not funny, but it's funny because I understand. I hear so many people talk about how they wish that they could go back to the partner that they had in the beginning. They were so great in the beginning. I apologize if I use a lot of he, she adjectives. This is a whole lot more commonly recorded for male murderers, female victims at this point. So there's a lot of likelihood that those are the adjectives that I'm going to use. But a lot of, I wish he was the person that he was when we got together. And part of why these women stay is because every once in a while he pulls that guy back out. Most of the time not, but every once in a while, to restore hope and to continue to keep her there because he knows that she wants it so bad, he'll pull that back out. So that is something that you can identify with. Be aware that's a big red flag. And I wanted to read a quote in that section too. It says, "It appeared that normal romantic expectations and activities were present." So it's not like these things are way out there, but the quote says, "sped up. Once commitment is secured, this seems to convey certain gendered rights and responsibilities, and once commitment is given by a female, it cannot be withdrawn." And that speaks to the fact that relationships tend to change and get more violent a lot of times after a couple gets married, or when she becomes pregnant, or right after the baby is born, depending on the relationship. But a lot of times violence amps up when she's pregnant. And definitely if you've gotten married, because then you have crossed this threshold and you become fully their property and you lose your humanity in these situations, in the way that they think. You are now theirs. And that is irrevocable unless they decide that it's okay to let you go. But you don't have any say in that matter anymore. Stage 3 is called relationship. That's what they decided to name it. In this stage, in the actual context of a relationship, the bulk of the relationship, coercive control was present in every case that she looked at. There were 372 of them. 372 women murdered by their spouses, and coercive control was a part of each one of them. That doesn't surprise me at all. So coercive control is defined as an act or a pattern of acts, and I would say it's a pattern, of assaults, threats, humiliation, and intimidation, or other abuse that perpetrators use to harm, punish, or frighten their victims. Some experts compare it to being taken hostage. Coercive control is why abusers can tell their partners what they can and can't wear, what they can and can't eat, who they can and can't talk to, where they can and can't work, whether or not they can get educated, and every other possible decision that she should be able to make on her own but isn't allowed to. Coercive control is that, like they said, being taken hostage. It's that complete control of your environment. It's as if you live in prison. You are only allowed to do whatever they say is okay, and you are threatened and you are punished and you are given examples of what will happen to you if you don't comply enough that you believe that it is not in your best interest to challenge that authority. Sexual violence, often paired with psychological abuse, was also present in a lot of these cases. In fact, Smith reported that many victims considered the sexual assaults to be consensual because they gave in order to get some peace. One of the quotes that they included in this article was, "She used to have sex with him to buy herself some peace. She knew that she had about 3 weeks peace if she would let him rape her." And I've known people in that situation too. I've been in that situation myself also. The study found that this stage, this relationship stage, could last anywhere from 3 weeks to, in one of those cases, 50 years. And I wanted to point out that it said when control was maintained, or the man didn't want to end the relationship, so as long as he kept the control and he was happy with this relationship, it could potentially last for a lifetime. In fact, they found through doing this study that the most common scenario is that an abusive relationship will continue indefinitely and it will not end in homicide, which is not what previous research would have indicated necessarily. Usually it's considered a progressive thing, but what they're looking at here is stage 4. It's a trigger. The trigger is the power and control of the dominant partner is challenged. When that happens, it continues this progression. So what it's saying is, if that doesn't happen, if the victim is okay with living under the thumb of this other person for the rest of their life, if they will continue to submit, then maybe not, they won't have to worry about murder. That's what they're saying. So stage 4, trigger, the difference between a relationship that is just for the rest of your life abusive versus one that ends in murder, is the existence of a trigger or triggers. The perpetrator feels like he's losing control. And this can be threats or attempts to leave or to get help, just as example, and then they're triggered into reacting with some kind of extreme violence. This is why when a woman wants to leave an abusive relationship, or a man, I'm sure that would be true for a man too, when somebody wants to leave an abusive relationship and they try, that is the most dangerous time for that person. From then until at least a year afterwards, because there's so much built up in this person that they will often continue to pursue longer than a year sometimes, a lot of times, but usually a year is a fair assessment that you're in serious danger for at least that long, because you have challenged their control and their authority. You've taken their power away and given it back to yourself where it should have been in the first place. And they're not okay with that. So be aware of that. A quote I wanted to read from here: "The reasons given for men killing their partners overwhelmingly revolved around withdrawal of commitment or separation. This separation could be real or imagined or just threatened. Attempts to separate in all our cases which progressed to this stage were met with significant resistance. Abusers justified their violence because they said that by attempting to end the relationship, their partners were failing in their roles as wives, as women, as partners. And they were insulting a member of the superior gender, which is men, as far as they're saying, who deserved unquestioning respect. That's why they felt that killing their partners was justified. The idea that he and only he gets to decide when a relationship is over reflects beliefs and values that are deeply embedded in these men who kill their partners. This is not like a little cultural thing. This is like they have probably been taught this in childhood to some extent, in some way, and it's just continued. It is deeply embedded in their belief system. If you ever read the book, Why Does He Do That? Linda Bancroft talks about how it's really difficult to get these guys to change, because in order for somebody to change, first and foremost, they need to believe that they need to change, and they need to want to change. And most of these guys do not believe that there's anything wrong with what they're doing, because that belief system is so deeply ingrained in them. They don't see it as wrong. When they're beating your face in, they do not see that as wrong. They see that as justifiable. They don't feel guilty about it because they didn't do anything wrong. There's nothing to feel guilty for. And therefore, there's nothing for them to want to change because they didn't do anything wrong in their eyes. Does that make sense? Those same ideological beliefs on gender roles work in reverse too. So while they think that we as females have certain roles, they also believe that they have certain roles, and they believe that it's important for them to be wealthy and successful to be a man. And if they fail at that, violence is a common thing. So unemployment and financial hardship are strongly linked to intimate partner homicide, specifically familicide, which is when they murder their entire family. So these same people with the same particular belief system feel like as a man, they need to be able to take care of and provide for their family. And if they can't, then they're more likely to kill their whole family so that their family doesn't have to suffer for their failure to be able to take care of them. Step 5 is escalation. After the perpetrator is triggered, they often escalate abuse to attempt to regain control over their victim. Perpetrators use a number of tactics to reestablish their control, everything from begging and crying to threats of violence, to actual violence and/or stalking, and sometimes suicide threats. The length of this stage differs with the relationships. Can you relate to any of that? Begging and crying for you to stay, threatening to hurt you or other people, actual violence, breaking things, stalking you, any of that, or threats to kill themselves if you won't come back because they just can't do it without you. All of those are bad signs. Obviously, crying and begging for you to come back, that's like low level, but if any of the other stuff, non-abusive people might cry and beg you to come back. So it's not like that's an indicator of scariness. The reason for that to be in here is so that you know that they're not always scary. Sometimes they use honey to try to get one back before they resort to the violent stuff. So just keep that in mind. Don't be fooled by that if they have had a tendency to be controlling in your relationship. Reaching stage 5 was very common. However, if the perpetrator was able to regain control, they didn't necessarily move on to stage 6, or at least not right away. Abusive relationships often cycle through different stages repeatedly until or if the perpetrator loses complete control. Then it is more likely than not that they will move on to stage 6 and eventually escalate to homicide. So stage 6 is called a change in thinking or decision, but this is basically when the abuser decides, murder might be a good plan here. Maybe I'll just take her out. That would be easier and better for everybody. This stage seems to occur in or at the end of a period of escalation, and it may be a response to a perceived irretrievable loss of control and/or status. The idea that homicide may be a possibility may occur at this time. So like if you leave and they don't think that they're going to be able to get you back, that would be considered an irretrievable loss of control. They can't get that control back because you're actually gone. That might be a time for maybe homicide. Or they find out that you have been cheating on them and you're just never going to be able to be the person that was faithful in their mind ever again. You have crossed that threshold. It is now an irretrievable loss of control. So when they're escalating abusive tactics that they're using in that escalation part, when they start to feel a loss of control, when those don't get the results that they're hoping for, then perpetrators might move into making more permanent acts of violence, also known as murder. In many cases, the level of planning found in homicide investigations suggests that there had been a considered decision to kill made at some point. So that fantasy that movies and TV shows and even the news, honestly, even when they're covering news stories of intimate partner homicide, I have noticed in researching them, they have this tendency to say random or senseless acts of violence. And they're so amazed, and everybody in the community that they talk to, oh, I talked to this person before, or I saw them out and I never would have guessed. It's just so surprising. Oh my gosh. And people try to portray this as, well, obviously there was something that happened, and this was a moment of rage and passion in which this person murdered their partner. And evidence just doesn't support that. It really doesn't. At some point in that relationship, this person made a choice that they were going to murder their partner, and then they planned for it, which is the next stage, and then they acted it out. It was not in a moment of rage and passion. It was a planned, thought out, decided, conscious choice. It's premeditated murder. Their decision to murder their partner was often considered a rational and justified response to injustice by their partner. The change in thinking appears to have an association with feelings of injustice, entitlement to act, and a belief that there is a social or cultural solidarity with the offender's position. I included that because it's important. They basically feel like they're justified in murdering their partner because they feel like the partner has been unjust to them by leaving them or trying to leave them. They feel entitled to be able to commit murder because they're just acting on something that's their possession anyway. It's not a human who has rights and feelings and a life. They have a right to it, they're entitled to it, and they believe that culture and society are going to back them up on it. They believe that culture and society say that the man is superior, that he has the ultimate say, that women are less valuable, and that it's okay for them to murder their spouse or their significant other because she's their possession ultimately. And they don't feel bad. They do not feel like they're wrong in this situation. And not only do they not feel wrong within themselves, they also feel like society is going to agree with them. They're in the right. How dare she try to leave? How dare she go to an abused shelter because he beat her? How dare she try to take back any kind of power of her own in her own life? Stage 7 is the planning stage. There was, in this study, usually some indication of planning on the part of the murderer, including evidence of internet searches for specific methods of killing, attempts to isolate the victim, purchases for things like firearms, knives, hammers, things to decompose bodies, etc., plans to conceal the body, looking into life insurance policies or wills, and even sometimes evidence that they were stalking their significant other or ex to gather information so that they would know where she would be and who she would be with, etc. The planning stage could potentially last anywhere from a couple of hours to, in one case, it lasted over 12 months. When stalking continues, risk of homicide remains high. I'm going to say that again, just in case you missed it. When stalking continues, risk of homicide remains high. So if you have an ex who is still stalking you, you are in danger of murder. Also be aware that attempting to get the partner alone in order to inflict violence or other harm is extremely common behavior. Abusers frequently use children in these relationships to harass their victims through the courts and to keep track of their whereabouts. And stage 7 is homicide. The final stage is the homicide itself, and this may involve extreme levels of violence, even in previously non-violent people. I could have just said stage 7 is homicide, or stage 8 is homicide, done deal. But they put in some good information that I want you to know here too. The severity of past abuse does not necessarily increase the likelihood of murder. In other words, a man who hits his partner one time is just as likely to murder her as the man who strangled and raped his partner every night. If they both progressed through all 7 of the other stages, then they're both likely to murder. The last stage can also include murdering children, other family members and other members of the public. Many mass shootings were preceded by or they're part of murder of an intimate partner. And also it can include murder of the perpetrator himself or murder-suicides. It can include when a victim goes missing. Beware of the man with a history of abuse who claims that his wife just up and ran away. So the main thing that I wanted you to get in that, aside from the fact that murder happens to partners and exes frequently, in fact, is that their previous physical abuse is not an indicator one way or another. Now, there are definitely statistics that say if there's a firearm in the house and they're an abuser, you're 500 times more likely to die because of that firearm and that abuser who has control over that firearm. There are statistics that say that somebody who is an abuser who chokes you is 700 times more likely to kill you, either at that point or some other point in the future, than some average person. You are 700 times more likely to die than this average person if they are putting their hands on your throat, because usually that's one of the final steps before murder, or that's part of the murder itself. But according to this study of close to 400 women who were murdered, it did not matter if he beat her all of the time or if there was only one altercation. They may not have been violent at all and they can still murder. I mean, if you look at the instances of murder-suicides, a lot of times those were not violent abusers beforehand. A lot of times those were men who put all of their identity into that relationship and that person. And when she tried to leave, he didn't have himself anymore. He didn't know who he was. And so as opposed to losing himself in that way, he just killed her and then killed himself because he didn't want to live without her. And there doesn't have to have been any violence ahead of time for that. I hope that you got some good information. This was excellent information in my opinion. I hope that you learned something. And if you see yourself anywhere in this pattern, please take that seriously. And if you see somebody that you know in this pattern, help them get that information. Victims of domestic violence leave on average, I believe it's 7 times before they leave for good. That's because it is not a small thing. It's a big deal. There's a lot of factors involved, and it takes a lot for a person to get to that point. Maybe your person's not at that point yet, but maybe seeing this list and seeing where they are in this progression will help. Thanks for watching. I'll do my part to keep you safe by continuing to put out weekly videos about all things related to intimate partner violence. If you haven't already, please do your part by subscribing to this channel and hitting the notification button so that you don't miss a single video. Bonus points if you share videos with people that you believe will benefit from the information. Until I see you again, stay safe.